This is Wild West and Wizards, and with a name like that, I kind of had to check it out. I'm sort of a sucker for like alternate history stuff and real settings done in like alternate ways, that sort of thing. And well, the Wild West isn't really one that you see done that way all that often. A lot of at least in video games, a lot of the times you see it's done in like the most authentic way possible, stuff like Red Dead Revolver and Red Dead Redemption, for instance. But occasionally you do see something like this, the Wild West setting done in a different, alternate sort of way. And in this case, as you can probably tell by the title, there be wizards. And it's sort of an open world RPG where you are a gunslinging wizard trying to solve the problems of this world. And the world itself is surprisingly large, although you start out in what you would consider the traditional sort of Wild West setting, lots of scorpions, arid hills, and big canyons, and everything is kind of orange. But it's kind of interesting to start that way in, a quintessential Wild West setting, but eventually end up in, by the end of the game, you're in like a big forest wizard tower fighting ice elementals and stuff like that, all within the same game. And like I said, I'm a sucker for things like that. I enjoy settings that kind of subvert themselves in strange ways, and settings that definitely kind of subvert your expectations, and you end up from where you began, you end up in a very different place. That's probably why JRPGs, when I was growing up, were like a big thing for me, because a lot of the early like Final Fantasies and things like that had a similar vibe. You started in a fairly average like fantasy setting, but you ended up in some sort of weird like Magitech facility with like robots and aliens and stuff like that. So having settings just end in a very weird, different place from how they began is just sort of a thing that I enjoy a lot. So I was happy to see an open world RPG in the modern day actually sort of taking that approach, only with the Wild West. You will begin by creating a character in just like a basic character creation. Choose from one of 3 classes, which mostly determines the skills that you start with, as well as the skill tree you have access to, but you can actually learn any spell in the game because it's done via a scroll system. You have to pick up scrolls, and you can just take them to a wizard in a town and have them teach you the spell for some cash. But you do have a talent tree that is different for each class, and at the end of the talent tree there will also be some exclusive spells that you can get a hold of. For instance, the one that I'm playing is the newest one that was sort of added in a recent update for the launch of the game, and is like a sort of witch doctory class using lots of life manipulating things, like life drain spells and the like. And the final spells that you get access to in the skill tree are things like a big blind and fear AoE that's pretty powerful. Actually, I think it's like a poison as well. It's just like all of the nature effects roll into one spell in an AoE, and a spell that allows you to just drain health from all the damage that you do, including just basic unenchanted shots, which is pretty sweet. Very powerful, but you can't use it that often, and it only lasts for a few seconds. So it's good during boss fights and the like. And that, I guess, brings us to the combat. So the combat is, as you would probably expect, an FPS RPG hybrid, and it actually does it pretty well. There are several different weapon types that you'll have access to. You can carry 2 weapons at once. You will have revolvers, shotguns from the single shot and double barrel variety, as well as repeaters that use revolver ammo but tend to do less damage per shot but have a lot more shots per reload, like 10 rather than 6, and also rifles, just long-range, single-shot rifles. Since this is a Wild West setting, despite there being magic, most of the weapons are in that sort of same primitive idea. You don't have like repeating weapons or anything like that. They're all single-shot or just few-shot weapons. But that does add an interesting sort of dynamic to the combat, because you're going to want to be using your spells to supplement your actual damage, and having just sort of basic weaponry at the same time as these spells makes for kind of a neat combat system, honestly. And one thing that you'll notice pretty much immediately is that the projectile spells, the actual main damage spells, all travel really, really fast, which is sort of cool. Bullets actually do have travel time in this. The weapons are not hit scan, so if you're, fighting someone at a very long range with a rifle, for instance, you will have to sort of lead them a little bit. And these spells travel at a very similar speed to the bullets, which I thought was kind of a nice touch, because a lot of times when you think of like a Wild West, you think of gunslingers and very fast, lethal combat. Everyone draws and then everyone except for one person dies like immediately, basically. And I like that the spells actually do that. They're not like big, slow-moving, obvious projectiles or anything. They're like these very fierce, fast, hard-hitting projectiles that are just about as fast as the bullets themselves, which, if you think about a Wild West setting using wizards, kind of makes sense, because you would want the spells to be pretty much as immediate as the guns, and they are. The guns themselves also have multiple ammo types, which, as you know, I'm a fan of. The rarer ammo types do a larger percent of the damage of the weapon, all the way up to the blue rarity rare bullets, which do something like 150% of the damage or something like that. They're very strong, but they're expensive and you don't find them all that often, so stockpiling them for hard bosses and stuff is a valid strategy. And at first, I thought it was kind of strange that there weren't any like enchanted ammo types, like fire bullets or poison bullets or something like that, instead of just having the more basic rarity-based like damage multiplier bullets ammo types. But instead, they actually have spells that enchant your shots, and I kind of like that instead because it allows the enchanted ammo to go along with the other ammo types. So if you use, a spell that gives you an explosive shot and you use it with like the very high damage, high rarity bullets, then you get like a higher multiplier for your spell. So I like that they sort of stack together like that, and the combat as a whole is pretty satisfying because of all of this, the very fast nature of the projectiles and the spells. The very high damage of you and your enemies means that unless you're fighting, large bosses, then most of the combat tends to be pretty quick because you'll either die or kill all the enemies pretty fast. Damage is in high numbers, and no one has like massive amounts of health, again, except for bosses. So your average sort of struggles in dungeons and the like will be between quite a few enemies as you clear them out, which makes it feel more like a dungeon crawling RPG a little bit, because you'll have lots of enemies that you kill pretty quickly in waves and just looting as you go through. And really, because of the way the loot system works, that's actually a pretty apt comparison. It is really like an action RPG, but just with a very different theme than what you usually see, because you do have a rarity-based loot system with colored loot, from your white normal loot to green to blue to like, epics and legendaries and unique stuff with extra effects, and all that is here. And you have, besides the weapons that all come in those different varieties, you also have chest armor, boots, gloves, rings, all of the kind of stuff that you would expect from an ARPG, effectively. And I guess that's really what this is when it comes down to it. It is a first-person ARPG just with the Wild West and Wizards theme, which is pretty sweet. And the loot actually does carry a good amount of value to it, because I know that some action RPGs like to make the loot kind of boring. It'll, like plus 3% damage, plus 5% crit chance, that sort of thing. But in this case, especially with the higher rarity loot, there's some really neat effects. You can get like a sort of a druid trapper's rifle that can snare people and do like slow them down a whole bunch, or like a revolver that is from like a forge master that sets people on fire when it hits them, all sorts of things like that. So the loot does have a lot of interesting passive effects, and they aren't just like, basic percentage boosts to stats or anything. Especially the higher rarity stuff does have some actual exciting effects, which is one of the things that I always look for in like a rarity based loot system, is the higher rarity loot more than just a stat, better stats. Does it actually have some fun stuff? And in this case, it does. There's some really neat effects to some of the high rarity things, especially when it comes to things like armor that retaliates for you. That's always one of my favorite things. It sends like ice shards back at enemies or drains the health of enemies that hit you, that sort of thing. And there's stuff like that here, so that's really cool. The world that you're in is impressively large. There's actually a lot to it. As I mentioned, you'll start in the quintessential Wild West tumbleweeds and scorpions setting, but as you zoom out on the map, you'll discover that there are two other sort of biomes that you get to go to, and they're each quite large. There is a large sort of plateau above the deserty area that you start in that has more of like the prairie plains kind of setting, like sparse vegetation and just sort of general greenery, a little bit more than your average desert setting, with some like big prairie houses and that kind of thing. And then eventually also past the mountains from that setting, there's a forest, a pretty dense, large, green, verdant foresty area with rivers and waterfalls and everything. So it's pretty neat. Like I said, it adds to that feeling of adventure when you start in a familiar setting, but you end up somewhere very different, doing very different things than you would kind of expect, which is cool. And there are even wizard towers in these, and in fact, they're sort of like the end-game dungeons. There are 3 of them, one in each of the biome areas, and they're pretty tough. They generally involve like a sort of a combat floor, a puzzly floor, and then like a boss. Well, usually multiple bosses, but a final boss at the end. So that's cool. And there are other dungeons as well, everything from just small caves to temples and ruins and other dimensions and some stuff like that, which is cool. And there's also, of course, tons of questing, side quests, all that sort of thing. So the world is very much an RPG world. It's large, it's pretty fully featured, there's a lot to see. If I had one complaint about the game, and it's kind of a petty complaint at this stage, honestly, but if I was to make something, it would be that the world almost feels a little bit too large. And by that I don't mean that there's nothing to see. That's very much not the case. There's a lot to explore and find. The Steam page even says, pick a direction and wander that way to find stuff, and you definitely will. There is plenty to discover, but I kind of feel like the world is so large that it almost, like, I don't know, begs for a mount or something. I don't know if it's because in my brain I associate Wild West setting with riding a horse, so I expect to, like, be able to ride a horse around. But I kind of feel like you could maybe just trim some of the empty space between areas out a little bit, and you wouldn't really lose anything, because there's still a lot of stuff to discover. It's just there's a lot of space in between each individual thing, and although it does add to the sense of sort of grandeur of the world, I think that sometimes because of the sheer amount of walking in between some of the farther away areas, that it could be trimmed down a bit, and you wouldn't really lose anything. You'd still have a nice, dense world full of stuff to discover. It's a fairly petty complaint, because really, especially once you get a lot of places discovered, you get like speed spells and teleportation and all that. It doesn't take that long to move around the world. But I did find, especially in the more desert area, that some of the points of interest, although there were plenty of points of interest to see, there was a lot of space in between those points of interest that I'm not sure, it kind of didn't feel like it needed to be there because of your walking speed and all that, but like I said, petty complaint. I also enjoy that there doesn't seem to be any sort of level scaling for the areas, so you can easily, start the game and wander into a super high level area with really hard enemies that like two-shot you, but still maybe be able to kill them and get something really nice for yourself later, that sort of thing. And that's kind of important to me in action RPGs, is if there's going to be a lot of like level-based content, like dungeons that have levels, loot that has levels, enemy that have levels, that these levels are not necessarily tied specifically to you. That way you can feel like you've conquered something when you actually get stronger than them, and you can maybe get some high-level stuff early to save for later, that kind of thing. And this game does have that. I actually deliberately went out of my way to check, once I saw that all the enemies had levels and stuff, if there were, if everything was just sort of synced to you, or if some areas were just really high level by default. And that is the case. So you do have to be careful where you wander, but it does give you, like I said, that sense of discovery and, well, wonder when you get into some of these areas and just sort of fight your way through them a little bit in some of the very difficult enemy waves to get some like high level gear and then escape back to the main quest with some of that high level gear. It's a nice feeling, and I always enjoy games that allow me to do that. As I mentioned, there are plenty of side quests to find. The main quest line is a fairly long one, and there's a lot of different areas that it will take you to. It seems to be pretty well paced, so that, you don't really, it doesn't feel that you need to grind to do the main quest. Like, by the time you get to the really, really hard stuff, it'll take a while, and you've been through a lot of the world, so you will also have some really good loot and be pretty high level yourself. The level cap seems to be 20 for the player, although that does not seem to be the case for enemies. Some enemies are a higher level than that, to emphasize how powerful they are. And as you would expect, the side quests help to supplement your level gain and your loot gain to give you some better gear and all that sort of thing. And they tend to have some pretty good variety to them. In fact, one of the higher points of this game for me is the puzzle solving. Unexpectedly, there are a lot of areas with puzzles to solve. A lot of side quests are just hidden areas in general that you just sort of happen upon a mystery, and it's up to you, if you want to just sort of delve into it and see what you can find. From your more usual like RPG puzzles, like, finding keys and the like, to unraveling small mysteries like, why is this wizard school abandoned? Why are all these doors locked? How do I get into all these cases? And eventually, as you start finding areas like that more and more often, you'll discover that actually a pretty significant part of this game involves not just combat, but like RPG puzzle solving. And that's really cool, because it helps to give you a break from the combat, and also it helps to reward exploration by giving you more than just more combat to find. You'll find all sorts of other areas too that have little mysteries or subtle things for you to get yourself out of. Maybe you'll just find a shiny rock and you'll poke the rock and you'll end up in someone's weird dungeon in their basement for who knows what reason, and you have to find your way out and discover why that happened. And it's just little encounters like that almost remind me of like Fallout New Vegas a little bit, like how it kind of went when you just explored the world and happened upon random stuff. It wasn't always combat. There could be some other stuff that you found that was just interesting to go towards, and maybe you got something cool out of it at the end of it, and that's how this feels as well. And that sense of rewarding exploration is really important for me in like an open world RPG, so the fact that it seems to be very prevalent with lots of, puzzle solving areas and little mysteries to happen across is super cool. The game is also only $15. It's $14.99 on Steam. That's not on sale or anything. That's just its normal price, which is pretty cheap, in my opinion, for the amount of stuff that you're getting here. If you want to know, like, gameplay time-wise, I'm 20 hours into it myself, and I'm not quite done yet. I still have about half of the forest area to explore, as well as one more wizard tower to do. So I'm going to say probably like 18 to 22 hours gameplay time on average for, like, your average person, which is pretty fantastic, honestly, and it's an enjoyable 20 hours that I've had. I've pretty much enjoyed all of it. Of particular note also are things like what you're seeing in the background right now. Some of the later game and just larger in general boss fights almost remind me of like MMO style raid boss fights, which I did not expect, and again helps to give you that weird sense of like, this is not the game that I started playing, this has all changed so much, and it's just cool to do these like more mechanically complex, multi-phase, almost raid-like boss fights sometimes. That's a really neat touch, honestly, and it helps to cement the whole, you are not just in the Wild West, this is also like a weird fantasy situation. It's pretty sweet. There are a couple of bugs that I've encountered. One is that one particular kind of buff seems to like respawn me in the air sometimes, so if you see me like hopping around in the background, that's not because I'm jumping, that's because one of the buffs just sort of does that. I'm not sure what that's all about. And also, you'll occasionally find that jumping acts strange, and it's very easy to get caught on geometry when you're like going up stairs or ledges, and sometimes you'll have to sort of jump back and forth to get yourself in the right orientation to make it up certain areas. But that doesn't seem to happen all that often. Still something to mention though. So that is Wild West and Wizards. It's a really impressive project for such a small team, and it is just a fun FPS RPG in general when I know those games are not that easy to make. Pretty nice art style too. So thank you guys very much for watching. The link is in the description below this video as usual. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.